Welcome everyone, my name's Laura, I'm the Welfare Officer at Aberystwyth Students Union, and I'd like to invite you today to join us for the Students Union consultation event on the Renting Homes Bill, which I've got here. I'm delighted to be joined by representatives from the Welsh Assembly, but also delighted to be joined by Elin Jones, our Assembly Member for Ceredigion, who I'm going to ask some questions on the Renting Homes Bill. Welcome Elin, thank you very much for joining us.
No problem.
So what has brought about this bill?
Well, I think there's been quite a bit of discussion in Wales for a long time now about the need to look at the rented sector and to provide legislation to protect tenants, either in the private or public rented sector. The Law Commission did a lot of work on providing the right kind of basis for legal contracts for tenants. And of course the Welsh Assembly, the National Assembly, now has lawmaking powers in its own right since the referendum in 2011, and now can start to properly legislate to meet the needs of Wales, and in this particular case to meet the needs of tenants in Wales, whether they be student tenants or tenants more generally in communities, so that there is a clear understanding from both landlords, and tenants of what the expectation of Welsh Government is in terms of the legal underpinning of contracts and the standards of the rented sector.
Thank you. Well, basically, in the Students' Union, we see a lot of students who have a lot of housing issues, and a lot of the time it comes down to unfair contract terms. How will the bill look to address unfair contract terms?
Well, I think that one of the big issues for students and for those people in the private rented sector more generally is going to be the fact that there will be a standard contract proposed in the legislation, so that landlords and tenants will look to work from a standard contract which is the same in Aberystwyth as it would be in Cardiff and Bangor, and that all landlords would look to use that contract. That provides then assurances for students, especially when they're completely new to the private rented sector, coming maybe from family homes and then from university accommodation into the private rented sector. They need to know that any contract they are going into with private landlord has a legal underpinning to it and is a standard contract that is easy for them to understand and easy for them to challenge any landlord on. And I think from listening to students in Aberystwyth and in Lampeter, also in my constituency, they want to know that there is a contract that they can trust.
Would you say this will give students more rights in their contracts?
Well, I think that we'll see what's in the legislation. Of course, this legislation isn't passed yet, so I have to urge all students really in Aberystwyth and elsewhere to get involved in this consultation. So the kinds of things that are important, that are issues that are creating problems for students at the moment, that they want to see in legislation, to have their rights protected in legislation. This is the time to influence Welsh law as it's being made. It's too late once the law is made, and that will happen in about 2 years' time when this legislation comes to an end and is there on the statute book. Now is the time to influence the content of it and to get the rights for students, as all tenants, enshrined in the legislation.
Another issue we face is the standards of accommodation. We've done a lot of work to address that this year. How will the bill look to address private sector standards?
Well, I think that I would like to see within the legislation that it has some kind of minimum standards, especially in health and safety. You know, that has to be part of the standard contract that a landlord signs with a tenant. So in the detail of what those health and safety minimum standards should be, then of course that will need to be in the legislation. And I will look to work with students in Aberystwyth to make sure that as the bill passes through its legislative process, and this takes time to get it right, that as it goes through that legislative process, that I work with students in Aberystwyth to see what we can do to amend the legislation. There are several phases to this. Now we're going through, the Welsh Government is going through its consultation on what it wants to put in the bill. Once the bill is published next year, then we can look to amend the bill through the democratic process of the National Assembly, and that will provide a vehicle then for students in Aberystwyth and the Students' Union in particular to work with me as an elected member in this area to try and amend the bill to get it as right as possible for the issues that affect students in their daily lives with their issues with landlords in Aberystwyth.
When will we, I know you've touched upon this already, but when will we be likely to see the changes come into place?
Well, the legislation itself will probably finish its process through the democratic process in around 2015, before the end of this Assembly term. So it will come into force probably in early 2016 in that case. You know, there's a reason behind the length of introduction, and that's because Welsh Government and the National Assembly needs to get it right. So to get it right, you have to consult on its content, which is happening now, and then to look to amend the legislation through the scrutiny committees. And I know the Students' Union has been involved in the Petitions Committee already in advocating issues around better standards of housing. So the Students' Union can work with elected members of all political parties to make sure that there are amendments in the legislation that better reflect the issues that need to be tackled from a student perspective. Because it's important to remember this isn't just a student-rented legislation, this is all rented legislation, so it's social rented sector, private rented, and of course within that the student population as well.
And finally, how can students participate in the consultation?
Well, here, now, today is one way of doing that. And also, of course, in the consultation itself has a closing date in early August to put forward ideas and views on the kinds of suggestions that are coming out from Welsh Government on standard contracts in private rented sector, but also to get involved with the Students' Union, the work that you're doing in promoting the rights and the issues that students have with their with their landlords, and also with the democratic process itself, the elected members such as me and others in the National Assembly who can advocate the case for a better deal and a better legislative underpinning for Welsh students in Wales.
Well, fantastic. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'd encourage everyone to log on and look out for this white paper. And I'm delighted that our colleagues from the Welsh Assembly will now take us through the consultation process, go through the bill with you and explain how you can get involved. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good morning, and thanks very much for giving us this morning the opportunity to come and discuss in a little bit further detail the renting homes proposals for legislation on improving tenancy reform within Wales. Welcome, my name is Lowri Norrington-Davies. I'm Communications Manager for the bill, and we will be joined later for questions and answers by my legislative colleague John Roach. So this is an overview of the Welsh Government's aim for flexible and efficient housing system across Wales. So what am I going to cover? I'm going to cover the current picture, examples of practical problems, why there are calls for reform within Wales, reform elsewhere in UK, what else has already been done within the UK to improve the renting system, how tenants can be affected, how landlords are going to be affected, and specific aspects of the proposals. What I've done today, though, is to try and tailor it so it is specific for students and they can get an understanding of how it's going to affect them within the private rented sector in Wales. So the current picture. Almost 1 in 3 people rent from across the social or private rented sector within Wales. Tenants, it's been proven, are less happy than their owner-occupiers. So renting often seen as a last option. There are 2 types of renting. There's long-term secure and there's short-term, which is currently used by students within Wales. There are many different types of tenancies out there, which is where the issues are. What we're trying to do is to make sure that we simplify the process. There are demoted, there are introductory, there are assured tenancies, there are family intervention, there are rent act tenancies. What we're trying to do is make sure that there is a simplified system so that anybody renting within Wales understands their rights and, as a landlord, responsibilities also to tenants. There's unnecessary complexity there currently, and we're going to try and minimise that so that there is one standard process. So examples of some of the practical problems currently out there. It's difficult quite often to establish what type of tenancy exists or whether it's a licence. Between the landlord and the tenant, tenants' agreements are very difficult to understand. There's quite often huge confusion around the type of tenancy they've got, the terms that are in it. Absent joint tenants, which is something that would affect students within multiple occupancy properties. If there's a tenant that moves from there or was to finish their course, how that's dealt with, or if somebody has had a falling out with other tenants within a joint tenant, this hopefully is going to make it easier for people to resolve disputes. Domestic abuse and relationship breakdown, again within tenancies. This legislation is going to help it better to be able to deal with that, as well as renting by 16 and 17-year-olds. Calls for reform. So Lord Justice Wolfe said reform of substantive law in housing could do more than anything else to reduce the cost and the delay. Nick Madge, Circuit Judge, said the housing law has become an impenetrable forest. There are very few paths through the forest known only to the skillful lawyers. What everybody is saying is that actually it's a difficult process. Even the lawyers don't necessarily understand the underpinning law in relation to renting within Wales. As we said on the offset, there's been reform elsewhere in Wales. There's been reform within Northern Ireland, where a single social tenancy has been in existence since 1983. Scotland have got a single social tenancy, and England has brought the fixed-term flexible social tenancies. That is something that I would like to have we don't intend doing in Wales. So Rented Homes White Paper, what is it? It's based on the Law Commission's substantive work that was conducted in 2006. They worked hugely to look at how they could make a system that was fair and would work for people renting. It's a single legal framework for social and private renting. And it's going to enable social tenancies for Wales, clarity on rights and responsibilities through written contracts. That's something I probably need to make sure there's going to be a clear written contract for tenants to understand their rights and responsibilities. It will be available in a number of different formats in plain, clear language, and to be freely available to all so they can understand their rights. So there are two forms of contracts that we're currently proposing: a secure contract based on the current local authority, secure tenancy, and a standard contract similar to that, assured tenancy. It's going to be an improved framework for supported housing. So how are tenants going to be affected? Well, it's going to be easy to understand written contracts from the offset. So when anybody moves into a property, they will get a written contract which will give responsibilities for not only them, but also for the landlord for that property. It's going to better address antisocial behaviour. So if there is any antisocial behaviour within that multiple occupancy property, there's going to be better ways for them to be able to deal with it. It's going to deal with domestic abuse and targeting the perpetrator. More flexible for joint tenancies. It's going to be easier for 16 and 17-year-olds to rent, and it's going to standardise the right to take over tenancies if somebody passes away, dies. Standardising eviction from the grounds of social tenants. Easier arrangements for short-term renting, which again is something that's probably quite often it's a 6 or a 12 month, but it may be that as a student you want to stay over the summer leave period, and therefore we're proposing that you may be able to rent on shorter terms, for instance a 2 to 3 month. And the main thing is the requirement for landlords to maintain the property to ensure no serious hazards are present. That will be written into the contract, so from the offset, students, tenants and landlords understand whose responsibility is to make sure that those properties are maintained to the appropriate level. How are the landlords going to be affected? Again, it's going to be an easier to understand written contract for landlords. It's going to be take out the complexity of what's currently there, to be easier for them to understand their rights and responsibilities. It's going to better address the antisocial. It's going to give them some key clauses so that if they have issues with antisocial behaviour, they know how they can deal with it. It's going to remove confusion over leases, lices, and the distinction between them. It's going to recover abandoned properties, and it's going to help to be able to deal with via court order. It's going to easily remove a joint tenant who is no longer resident. The model contracts are going to be freely available via a number of different means so that people can download and have copies of this legal document, which could be used then for anybody renting within Wales. The contractual responsibility to maintain the property will be written in, ensuring there are no serious hazards are present within that property from when the property is rented. It's going to make easier standards for short-term renting, and it's going to reduce the costs and complexity across the system. What we're proposing, 2 contracts. I'll probably just go straight to the standard, which is what will affect the private rented short-term sector. Low level of security protected by law, but a greater security we can agree through the fixed term, so you could have a longer term as at present. It's going to replace the assured short hold introduction to moated tenancies. So instead of having the 4 different tenancies, this is going to be one standard contract that can be used. It's going to provide much greater flexibility for short-term renting. Within the contracts, and it's probably something I won't go into hugely now, but if people would like to have copies of the contract, they are available via the web pages. There are going to be fundamental and supplementary additional terms. These are terms within the rental context that can be amended. They will include matters such as the landlord's repairing obligations, the circumstances in which the contract may be ended, and the actions which constitutes as unacceptable behaviour on the part of the tenant. Certain terms may be varied, and again it shows you in there will be some clauses that can help with varied issues that you can agree with the landlord to agree the omission or variation. In some cases, an omission or variation will only be allowed if it's for the better of the tenant. And we've got an example of fundamental term where requiring the landlord to give tenants at least 24 hours notice when they wish to enter the property. There's no way that that could be decreased, it would have to be increased. So all the terms are written in the contracts. If they could be amended, it can only be amended if they're for the better of you as a tenant. As well as the fundamental and supplementary terms, landlords and tenants will be able to include additional terms within the rental contracts, again for the better of the tenant. So the terms which may include matters such as whether pets are allowed into a property could be added to it, and they could be negotiated alongside the landlord. The All Wales Prohibited Conduct term. So contract holder, basically the tenants, may not use or threaten violence. The prohibited contact term is something that is going to be used to help alleviate antisocial behaviour in Wales. The actual terms and clauses within the contract will be what comes further later on in the legislative process, and we are currently working alongside antisocial behaviour teams in Wales and South Wales Police to make sure that it is fit for purpose, and it will help to combat antisocial behaviour within renting. It's going to complement the proposals for ending violence against women, working to the needs and understanding, but also broad enough to cover all potential forms of antisocial behaviour. There will be guidance made available via a DVD which can explain further examples of what antisocial behaviour is. So what we're hoping is right from the offset, people will understand their rights, not only by a written format, but maybe within a DVD format or within an easy read contract. There's going to be more flexibility around joint tenancies. Currently, the law is unhelpfully rigid and often puts people into vulnerable positions. Renting home treats each joint tenant as an individual. So if you're in a house of multiple occupancy, each of you will be classed as an individual within that property. It enables joint tenants to leave without ending a tenancy for everybody within there. So they would hand in their period of notice, but without everybody then having to lose that particular tenancy. The remaining joint tenants would be responsible for the rents, but they could still live within that property and find somebody to take on the additional room. Notice period applies for remaining tenants to then find somebody within that property. The other main thing that maybe might be of use is within the short-term tenancies, currently there's a 6-month moratorium, which is classed as the no-fault possession order. That's something that Welsh Government is proposing is removed. Currently, a court is unable to issue a no-fault possession order within the first 6 months of renting a short-hold tenancy. Most lets, as we know, are for 6 or 12 months, and if that's been agreed from the offset, it's proven that actually, in most instances, it's not used anyway. Only 9% of tenancies are usually ended by the landlord. It tends to be the actual tenant that ends the actual tenancy. Removal of this is going to allow it and going to make it much easier for individuals to be able to rent on a shorter term also. Implementation. What are our intentions? So model contracts are going to be available in advance of implementation. As we said, they're going to be hopefully available through a number of different organisations, electronically, via the internet, so that people can download prior, so they are aware of the terms and conditions that are going to be within these standard contracts. All existing tenancies would automatically transfer on that day. There won't be any need for the landlord to go out. So if you're in a current tenancy, you would remain within that tenancy until at that point you then had to fix a new period of 6 or 12 months. You would then at that point have to adhere or ensure that you use the standard contract. New tenants could be issued suitable points, therefore, as I said, going into the next year. Continued engagement with stakeholders is going to continue now, and that's why it's fundamental that we have these early discussions with you as NUS and students to make sure that what we are proposing is fit for purpose and that it works for people in Wales. This is the point, to make sure that your voices are being heard and that what the contracts contain is fit for purpose. These are the early stages to make sure that it is something that is going to work and make renting easier within Wales. As was discussed earlier, why the longer term? Well, again, to make sure we have the engagement, to make sure that we go through the appropriate processes and that we have standard contracts that are set in law. There will be further consultations again, hopefully next year, in relation to the contracts. So that's why it's important that now that everybody has their say in relation to these early proposals, prior to agreeing whether this is the way we need to move forwards, and then having their say into what information is actually contained within the contracts themselves. The draft bill will be considered by the Assembly in 2015, and then, if successful, it will be then operational at some point in 2016. How can you respond? A number of different ways. Today we've left copies of the white paper. On the back of them there are consultation questions which you could actually send in to the Renting Homes White Paper Policy Division within the Myfyrwyr office. There's also a Renting Homes website which you can go on, and there is an online consultation form. We've now had a number of consultation events via Wales discussing in depth these proposals. But again, if you'd like us to come and have a further discussion, please feel free to contact us.